Charlotte slammed the contract onto the table and hissed the words like a blade. "Fix the system in 5 minutes or you go to prison." The entire operations floor went silent as Caleb, a quiet single father in a worn jacket, glanced at the clock instead of lowering his head. Nobody in that room understood the collapse had never been his doing. 5 minutes later, every screen turned blue and buried data spilled out in front of the whole board. Charlotte froze completely, her voice gone, and then she knelt before the very man she had just threatened to destroy. Stay until the very end to witness the secret that finally brings an entire corporation to its knees before him. Caleb had once been one of the sharpest systems engineers the aerospace industry had ever quietly produced, the kind of mind that companies fought over without ever knowing his name. He built architectures other engineers spent years trying to understand, and he did it without asking for credit or attention. Then, a family tragedy reshaped his life, forcing him to step back from the fast climb he once had, and he chose a slower path as a contract engineer instead of a headline career. Nobody at the company knew the full story, and Caleb never offered it. He kept his answers short, his jacket the same one he always wore, and his focus entirely on the work in front of him. He raised a child alone, a fact he mentioned to almost no one, and he built his days around quiet routines rather than recognition. Colleagues sometimes assumed he lacked ambition because he never pushed for a promotion or a bigger title. In truth, he had already lived through enough ambition and loss to know what mattered and what did not. He measured his days not by promotions or titles but by whether the systems under his care ran cleanly, whether the people around him made it home safely, and whether he had kept his promises to the one small life depending on him outside of work. There was a stillness to him that some mistook for indifference, though anyone who worked alongside him closely enough eventually understood it was something closer to discipline, the kind forged by having already lost more than most people ever will. Charlotte was the opposite in nearly every way. She had become chief executive at an age when most people were still building their first resume, and she had done it through relentless focus on outcomes rather than excuses. She trusted numbers, deadlines, and signed contracts, and she had little patience for anyone who offered explanations instead of solutions. She believed, with the certainty of someone who had never been proven wrong in a boardroom, that enough money could buy any genius the company might need. Her success made her fast to judge and slow to listen, a combination that had served her well until the moment it did not. She ran meetings like countdowns, and she expected everyone around her to move at her pace or step aside. Colleagues who had known her the longest sometimes whispered that she had not taken a real vacation in years, that she measured her own worth by the size of the deals she closed rather than by anything happening outside the walls of the company. It was not cruelty that drove her, most who knew her agreed, but a fear of failure so deeply buried that she had long ago stopped recognizing it as fear at all, mistaking it instead for simple ambition. Connor held the title of Vice President of Operations, and for years he had quietly pushed to replace Caleb with an engineering team of his own choosing. He smiled easily in meetings and spoke the language of efficiency and loyalty, but underneath the polish he was hiding something far larger than office politics. He had learned exactly which systems nobody else fully understood, and he had begun using that gap for his own purposes long before anyone suspected a thing. He was skilled at reading a room, at knowing exactly which executives to flatter and which to quietly undermine. And he had built a reputation as dependable simply by never being caught doing anything that contradicted it. Behind closed doors, in meetings nobody else attended, he had spent nearly a year cultivating relationships with buyers who had no legitimate claim to the company's most sensitive research, treating the entire arrangement as a long, patient game rather than a single reckless decision. The company stood at the edge of signing a defense contract worth several $1 billion, the kind of deal that could define an entire decade of growth. Every executive had spent months preparing for the final review, flying in officials, rehearsing presentations, and polishing every technical detail until nothing seemed left to chance. The pressure in the building had been building toward this single week, and everyone from the newest analyst to Charlotte herself understood exactly what was riding on it. Then, without warning, the artificial intelligence control system locked itself down in the middle of a live demonstration. Every server the company depended on froze at once, screens filling with error codes nobody recognized and status lights turning an ominous shade of red across the entire operations wing. A countdown appeared on the main display, ticking downward with no explanation of what would happen when it reached 0, and within seconds every phone in the building seemed to be ringing at once. If the system could not be restored before the contract review resumed, the deal would collapse and take the company's reputation with it, along with years of painstaking negotiation and an untold amount of goodwill built with federal partners. Down the hall, the federal delegation waited in a conference room, unaware that anything had gone wrong at all, a fact that added an extra layer of urgency to every decision being made just out of their sight. Charlotte arrived on the floor within minutes, her expression already hardening into fury as she took in the chaos spreading across every monitor. She demanded answers from anyone within reach, and when none came fast enough, her voice rose until the entire room fell silent around her, engineers and assistants alike shrinking back from her path. Connor stepped forward almost too quickly, pointing directly at Caleb and suggesting that a contractor with deep system access was the obvious place to look for blame, his tone calm in a way that felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. Aaron, the technical director, tried to explain that the failure pattern did not match anything Caleb had touched recently, listing the modules and access logs that proved it, but his voice was lost beneath Charlotte's anger and the noise of alarms still sounding overhead. She was not in a mood to weigh explanations, only outcomes, and right now the only outcome she cared about was fixing the crisis before it became public and before the federal delegation waiting downstairs began asking questions of their own. She turned to security and gave a single order: keep Caleb in the building until this was resolved, one way or another. Nobody dared to ask what that meant exactly, and Caleb himself said nothing, watching the countdown with the same stillness he brought to every difficult problem, his hands resting calmly on the edge of the console in front of him. Charlotte stepped closer to him, closing the distance between them until there was no room left for hesitation, the entire room holding its breath at sight of her fury directed at one silent man. Her voice dropped into something colder and more dangerous than her earlier shouting had been, precise and final in a way that left no space for negotiation, every word chosen to make certain there could be no misunderstanding of the stakes. "Fix it in 5 minutes," she said, "or you go to jail." The words landed across the room like a verdict already decided, and for a moment nobody moved, waiting to see how the quiet engineer in the worn jacket would respond to an accusation with his freedom attached to the deadline. Somewhere near the back of the room, a junior analyst quietly began recording the countdown timer on her phone, uncertain whether she was documenting a resolution or a disaster, unable to guess which outcome was more likely given everything unfolding in front of her. Caleb set down the coffee he had been holding since before the crisis began, unhurried, and turned his attention fully toward the monitors without acknowledging the threat that had just been leveled against him. Caleb did not raise his voice or offer a defense. He did not point back at Connor, did not remind anyone of his record, and did not ask for sympathy even as the accusations kept piling onto him from every direction. He simply looked at Charlotte and asked for one thing: full administrative access to the system, immediately and without restriction, delivered in a tone so calm it almost seemed out of place in a room this tense. Charlotte refused on instinct, her trust in him already at zero, and she told him to work with whatever access he already had, since granting more felt to her like handing over the last thing she could still control. Connor seized the moment to keep pressing his narrative, suggesting that a contractor demanding deeper access in the middle of a crisis was exactly the kind of behavior that should raise alarm rather than earn trust, and several junior staff nodded along without questioning him. Grace, the company's internal counsel, stood near the back of the room and said little, but her eyes moved between Caleb and Connor with a growing and unspoken suspicion the kind trained lawyers learn never to voice too early. Working within the limited access he had been given, Caleb began tracing the collapse through layers of code most people in that room would never be able to read, his eyes moving faster than his hands could type. He moved quickly but without panic, his focus narrowing entirely onto the logs in front of him, while the countdown behind him continued its silent descent towards zero. Within minutes he noticed something that did not fit the story anyone had told so far, a discrepancy small enough that most engineers would have passed over it without a second glance. The administrative permissions on 3 critical systems had been locked from an internal account, not from any external contractor session, and the timestamps did not align with anything Caleb had done that day or any day before it. This was not a technical failure caused by overload or bad code, the kind of thing that could be explained away in a routine incident report. It had the fingerprints of something deliberate, something built to look like an accident while functioning exactly as intended, and Caleb had seen enough real failures in his career to know the difference immediately. He pulled up a second window, cross-checking the timestamp against building access records, and found that the same narrow window of time also matched an unusual login from a workstation rarely used outside of Connor's own office. Aaron leaned in over Caleb's shoulder and went pale as he saw the same pattern forming on the screen. He started to speak, then stopped himself, glancing toward Connor before choosing his words more carefully than before, uncertain whether voicing his suspicion out loud would help the situation or simply make it more dangerous for everyone involved. Charlotte, still furious and still convinced this was a stalling tactic, demanded to know how much longer this would take, her patience thinning with every second the countdown continued its steady march toward 0. Caleb did not answer her question directly. Instead, he said something quieter, almost to himself, though everyone close enough heard it clearly. If he opened this particular access level and traced it to its source, someone in that room was going to lose their position, and possibly far more than that, a statement delivered with no theatrics, simply as a fact he expected to be true within minutes. Charlotte, still convinced this was a delay tactic, reluctantly agreed to grant the exit Caleb had requested, if only to prove to herself and everyone watching that it would change nothing. The moment the permissions unlocked, Caleb opened the deeper system logs that had been sealed off from ordinary view, and the room grew quieter as line after line of activity streamed past on the main display. What he found did not look like an accident at all. Someone had gone in and carefully edited the audit trail, smoothing over gaps where activity should have appeared, leaving behind the kind of clean seams that only careful, deliberate work could produce. The internal camera feed covering the primary server room had also been disabled, its footage replaced by a static loop that anyone glancing at a monitor would assume was simply the live feed. A small detail that only someone searching for exactly this kind of manipulation would ever catch. Caleb traced the disruption back 3 days, well before the current crisis had begun, which meant whoever had done this had been planning long before today's deadline ever existed and had simply been waiting for the right moment to let it surface. Files tied to the flight control certification had been altered as well, subtle changes buried inside routine updates that would have gone unnoticed by anyone not specifically looking for them, changes small enough to pass every ordinary review yet significant enough to compromise the entire certification process quietly over time. Connor's composure began to slip for the first time since the crisis started. He shifted his weight, checked his phone, and remarked that he needed to step out to handle another matter, though nobody moved to let him leave. Aaron, watching the same data over Caleb's shoulder, felt the shape of the truth beginning to form even before he could put it into words, and the look on his face made Grace step closer, sensing that something far larger than a system failure was unfolding in front of them. Charlotte, however, remained locked in her earlier certainty, still convinced that Caleb was somehow buying himself time rather than uncovering the truth that would soon upend everything she believed about the people in that room. She crossed her arms and glanced repeatedly at the countdown, as though willing it to move faster through sheer force of frustration, unable yet to see what everyone else in the room was beginning to sense. Then Caleb found it, a hidden administrative account, created quietly and given permissions far beyond what any standard employee profile required, a shadow presence sitting inside the system for months without anyone noticing it was there. He opened its activity history and watched a timeline of quiet, careful actions unfold across the screen, each one small enough to avoid triggering an alert, yet together forming a pattern that could only have been built by someone who understood the system almost as well as Caleb himself did. Caleb restored the deleted portions of the log using recovery fragments most engineers would not have known existed, and the screen filled with thousands of transaction records nobody in that room had seen before. Grace moved closer immediately, cross-referencing the timestamps against contracts she recognized from her own files, her expression shifting from professional caution to open alarm. Connor's face drained of color as the pattern became impossible to misread even for people without deep technical training, and he took a half-step backward as though physical distance from the screen might somehow separate him from what it showed. The records showed that sensitive design data, the kind protected under strict federal contracts, had been quietly transferred outside the company over a period of several months. Someone had built a private pathway for moving files, disguising the transfers as routine backups so they would never draw attention during a normal audit. The same account responsible for locking the system today had authorized every one of those transfers, and the account traced directly back to credentials only Connor had ever used, a detail Grace confirmed twice before saying it out loud to the rest of the room. Charlotte stared at the screen, then at Connor, disbelief washing over features that had shown nothing but fury moments before. It became clear that Connor had not only sold proprietary data to outside buyers, he had also deliberately triggered today's system failure to create chaos convenient enough to bury his tracks, with Caleb positioned as the easiest person to blame. Even faced with the evidence glowing on the screen in front of the entire board, Connor refused to admit anything, insisting the data must have been planted, that someone was trying to frame him the same way he had tried to frame Caleb, his voice rising with each denial even as fewer and fewer people in the room appeared willing to believe him. Nobody believed him, not even the people who had trusted him only minutes earlier, and the silence in the room turned heavier with every passing second as the full shape of his betrayal continued to unfold. Then, before Grace could finish reading the last file into the record, every screen in the room went dark at once, and a new alert appeared warning that the primary servers were being wiped in real time from a remote connection. Connor had made his last move, choosing destruction over exposure now that his cover story had completely collapsed in front of the very people he had spent months deceiving. The room dissolved into panic as engineers shouted over one another, watching years of critical data disappear from the primary servers in real time. Backup systems that should have caught the wipe automatically failed to trigger, another sign of how thoroughly Connor had prepared for exactly this outcome long before anyone suspected him. Someone called out that the disaster recovery servers in the secondary facility had also gone dark, cutting off what should have been the company's last line of defense against exactly this kind of catastrophic failure. Charlotte's voice cracked for the first time that day, the fury replaced by something closer to fear as she realized how close the entire contract and the company's future had come to vanishing in an instant. She gripped the edge of the console, watching numbers and file names flicker and vanish across the screen, unable to do anything herself except witness the unraveling she had spent months working to prevent. Caleb remained still amid the chaos, his eyes fixed on the collapsing directories rather than the shouting around him. He did not need a backup because he had built much of this architecture himself years earlier, before his contract status, before the tragedy that reshaped his life, back when he had helped design the very foundation the company still depended on. He began reconstructing the system from memory, entering commands with a precision that made Aaron forget to breathe for several long seconds. Every module he rebuilt fit perfectly into place, as though he were simply retracing steps he had walked 1,000 times before rather than inventing a solution under pressure. He worked through the authentication layer first, then the flight control interface, and then the certification database, moving in an order that seemed to follow some internal blueprint only he could see. Nobody else in the room could have named the sequence, let alone executed it fast enough to matter, and even Aaron, who understood the system better than almost anyone, found himself simply watching rather than trying to assist. Aaron watched in open astonishment, unable to reconcile the quiet contractor from down the hall with the person now single-handedly holding the entire operation together. Charlotte, for the first time since the crisis began, looked at Caleb without suspicion or anger, seeing instead something she had completely failed to notice before this day. A level of skill and composure that no amount of money could reliably purchase. The countdown on the main display continued ticking downward, indifferent to the small miracle unfolding beneath it, each passing second narrowing the window in which recovery was still possible at all. Caleb finally looked up from the console just long enough to speak, his voice steady despite the impossible pressure bearing down on him from every direction. "I only have one chance to get this right," he said, and then he returned to the keyboard without waiting for a response, fully aware that failure now would cost far more than his own reputation. Around him, the room had gone almost completely silent, the earlier shouting replaced by a kind of collective stillness, as though everyone present understood instinctively that the smallest interruption might break whatever fragile process Caleb was holding together in his mind. Even Connor, still hovering near the edge of the room, seemed momentarily frozen, watching the man he had tried to frame now become the only person capable of saving the very deal Connor himself had tried to sabotage for his own gain. The countdown fell toward its final seconds as Caleb entered the last sequence of commands, his hands steady despite everyone else in the room holding their breath around him. For one agonizing moment nothing happened, the screens frozen in a silence that felt far longer than the few seconds it actually lasted. Somewhere behind him, Charlotte counted the seconds under her breath without realizing she was doing it, her earlier fury completely replaced now by a desperate hope that had nowhere else to go. Then, all at once, every monitor across the operations floor lit up in a clean, steady blue, and the artificial intelligence control system came back online exactly as it had been before the collapse began. The servers finished their restart in sequence, indicator lights shifting from red to green one bank at a time until the entire wing looked as though nothing had ever gone wrong. Data that had been wiped only minutes earlier reappeared in full, every file restored down to the last record, a complete recovery that should have been technically impossible without the backups Connor had disabled. The defense contract, along with the certification records tied to it, had been saved with only a handful of seconds left on the clock, a margin so thin that several engineers later admitted they had assumed failure was already certain. Relief spread through the room in a wave, engineers turning to one another in disbelief at what they had just witnessed happen in real time, some laughing in stunned relief while others simply stared at the screens as though expecting the recovery to reverse itself at any moment. Before anyone could fully process the recovery, new information began populating across the same screens, this time uninvited. Caleb's restoration process had pulled the deleted transaction records back into view automatically, laying out Connor's financial dealings across the main display for the entire board to see without a single line hidden or removed. Figures, transfer dates, and destination accounts appeared in sequence, forming a timeline of exactly how long the betrayal had been running and how much had already been sold to outside buyers. The board members who had gathered to review the defense contract now stared instead at evidence of corporate espionage playing out in front of them, the two crises tangled together in a single unfolding truth. Charlotte stood frozen at the center of it, watching the same screens that had nearly ended her company now expose the person she had trusted enough to hand real authority. One board member finally broke the silence by asking, quietly, how long this had been going on, and nobody in the room had an answer ready, since the scope of what had just been uncovered still seemed too large for anyone to fully measure in the moment. Nobody in that room said a word for what felt like a very long time, the silence heavier than any accusation could have been. Grace was the first to break the silence, stepping forward with the same measured caution she brought to every legal matter, though her voice now carried an edge of quiet conviction. She stated plainly, for the record and for everyone in the room, that Caleb bore no responsibility for the system failure and had in fact been the only reason the contract still existed at all. She turned toward Connor and laid out, point by point, how the evidence on screen matched exactly what she had suspected but had not yet been able to prove, referencing dates, transfer amounts, and account numbers that left no reasonable room for denial. Aaron confirmed every technical detail she raised, his earlier hesitation gone now that the truth no longer needed protecting, adding his own account of irregularities he had noticed over the past year, but had never felt confident enough to report on his own. Charlotte asked for the full log to be pulled up from the beginning, and as she read through it in silence, a different picture of Caleb began to take shape in front of her. Buried within routine maintenance entries were dozens of small, unlogged corrections he had quietly made over many months, patches to vulnerabilities long before they became emergencies, fixes credited to nobody because he had never once submitted them for recognition or reward. He had caught problems that could have caused failures far worse than today's crisis, and he had done it without asking for a bonus, a promotion, or even simple acknowledgement from the people who employed him. The realization landed on Charlotte with a weight that seemed to physically change her posture as she stood there. She had spent months treating this man as replaceable, as someone whose only value lay in following instructions under threat, when in reality he had been protecting her company from disaster after disaster without ever once mentioning it to her directly. Her earlier certainty, the belief that money alone could buy any level of talent she required, felt suddenly hollow against the evidence of quiet, unrewarded loyalty sitting right in front of her. Charlotte did not say anything for several long seconds, and then, without announcement or explanation to the board still watching her, she stepped back from the head of the table where she had commanded the room only minutes earlier. Grace watched her carefully, unsure what would come next, while Aaron exchanged a glance with Caleb that suggested even he did not know what Charlotte intended to do. The rest of the room waited too, the earlier tension replaced now by a different kind of uncertainty, one that had nothing to do with the contract and everything to do with what kind of leader Charlotte was about to choose to become in front of everyone watching her. Charlotte walked slowly across the floor toward Caleb, and every person still gathered in that room assumed they understood exactly what was about to happen. Several board members braced themselves for a dismissal, certain that Charlotte intended to remove Caleb from the building regardless of what the evidence had shown, simply to close the incident quickly and move forward with the contract signing. Connor, still cornered near the far wall under security's watch, seemed to expect the same outcome, a small and bitter satisfaction crossing his face at the thought that Caleb might still be punished despite everything. Instead, Charlotte stopped directly in front of Caleb and, without a word of warning to anyone in the room, lowered herself to one knee. Gasps spread across the floor as executives and engineers alike watched their chief executive kneel before a contract engineer she had threatened with prison only an hour earlier, the sound of chairs shifting and quiet murmurs rippling outward from the center of the room. Charlotte looked up at him and spoke plainly, her voice stripped of the authority she usually carried into every conversation. She said she was sorry, fully and without qualification, for insulting a man who had done nothing but protect the company she led, and she did not look away from him even as the silence around them grew heavier with every passing second. She admitted, in front of the entire board, that she had allowed her own power to cloud her judgment, dismissing a person's character before ever bothering to understand it. She admitted that she had trusted Connor's polished confidence over Caleb's quiet competence, simply because one matched the image of leadership she expected and the other did not. She admitted that fear of losing the contract had made her reckless with another person's dignity, and that no deadline, however large, justified the way she had spoken to him only minutes before. The room remained utterly silent, nobody quite sure how to respond to a chief executive publicly humbling herself in front of her own board and staff. Caleb, for his part, did not ask her to rise, nor did he offer forgiveness in dramatic terms. He simply said, in the same steady voice he had used throughout the entire crisis, that all he had ever wanted was for the truth to come out clearly, without anyone else being blamed for something they had not done. After a moment, he extended his hand toward her, a small and quiet gesture that helped her back to her feet, and the two of them stood facing each other in front of the entire board, neither one needing to say anything further for the room to understand what had just changed between them. Federal agents arrived within the hour, alerted by Grace the moment the evidence of stolen defense data became undeniable on the recovered logs. Connor was taken into custody quietly, without the dramatic outburst some in the room half expected, his earlier confidence completely gone by the time agents led him out through the same hallway he had walked through for years as an executive. A few staff members watched from a distance, saying nothing, while others returned quickly to their desks, as though needing the ordinary rhythm of work to steady themselves after everything that had just unfolded. Grace took direct control of the internal investigation that followed, coordinating with outside counsel and federal investigators to make certain every transfer, every altered file, and every dollar involved could be accounted for cleanly and completely, a process that would stretch on for weeks after the initial crisis had already passed. Aaron was promoted shortly afterward to oversee the technical division Connor had once controlled, a decision Charlotte made almost immediately given how clearly he had proven his competence and integrity throughout the crisis. He accepted the role with visible humility, telling colleagues privately that he intended to run the division with the same transparency Caleb had shown, rather than the secrecy that had allowed Connor's scheme to run unnoticed for so long. Charlotte herself chose not to hide any part of what had happened, deciding instead to hold a public briefing rather than quietly bury the incident behind closed doors and carefully worded statements. She stood in front of reporters and described in plain language both Connor's betrayal and her own failure to recognize the value of the man she had nearly destroyed over a deadline. She apologized to Caleb publicly, using his name without hesitation, making clear that the company's recovery depended entirely on skills she had almost thrown away out of anger and misplaced suspicion. Investors reacted immediately and harshly, and the company's stock price dropped sharply within hours of the announcement, wiping out a significant portion of its market value in a single afternoon of trading. Analysts speculated openly about whether the company could recover its reputation after such a public admission of internal failure at the highest level. Yet within weeks, the stock began climbing back, driven by an unexpected wave of public trust rather than the usual promises of growth or new contracts. Customers and partners alike responded to the honesty of Charlotte's handling of the crisis, several citing it directly as the reason they chose to continue working with the company rather than seeking alternatives elsewhere in the market. Industry analysts, initially skeptical that a public apology could ever help rather than hurt a major contractor, began pointing to the company as a rare example of accountability actually paying off in the long run. By the end of the following quarter, the company's reputation had not only recovered but strengthened, built now on a foundation of transparency nobody inside the organization had expected to matter quite this much. A few weeks after the incident, Charlotte called Caleb into her office, a space he had never once entered in all his time working for the company. The office itself looked different to him now, less like a symbol of distant authority, and more like an ordinary room where an ordinary conversation was about to happen. She offered him the position of Chief Technology Officer on the spot, along with a salary and title far beyond anything his contract had ever included, telling him plainly that the company owed him a place at the highest level of leadership after everything he had done to save it. Caleb declined without hesitation, thanking her for the offer but explaining that leadership had never been what drew him to this work in the first place. He preferred the quiet clarity of solving a technical problem to the constant negotiation and politics that came with managing people, and he had no interest in trading one for the other simply because circumstances had shifted so dramatically in his favor. Charlotte studied him for a long moment, clearly struggling to understand a decision that ran completely counter to everything she had built her own career around. She asked him directly why he would turn down more money, more authority, and more recognition than he had ever had before, especially after finally receiving the credit he had long deserved. It was a question she had likely never had to ask anyone else in her professional life, since most people she worked with chased exactly what she was offering him now. Caleb answered simply, without any trace of false modesty or hidden ambition behind his words. He told her that he preferred fixing machines to fixing people, that systems responded predictably to careful, honest work in a way that human politics never did, and that he found more satisfaction in solving a single elegant problem than in managing an entire department's worth of them. He added, almost as an afterthought, that he had someone waiting for him at home each evening who mattered far more to him than any title the company could offer, and that the life he had built for himself, quiet as it was, suited him exactly as it stood. Charlotte sat back in her chair, quiet for a long moment, absorbing an answer that reshaped something in how she understood leadership itself. She did not push him further, and instead, for perhaps the first time in her career, she let another person's choice stand exactly as it was, without trying to change it to fit what she thought success should look like. Several months passed, and the company that had nearly collapsed under Connor's betrayal slowly became known instead as a model of transparency within the industry. Other executives began studying how Charlotte had handled the crisis, particularly her decision to admit fault publicly rather than manage the story behind closed doors, and several competitors adjusted their own internal policies as a direct result of what they had watched unfold. Business schools even began referencing the incident in leadership courses, using it as an example of how accountability, however painful in the moment, could ultimately rebuild trust faster than any carefully worded statement ever could. Charlotte herself had changed in ways that went far beyond a single public apology delivered under pressure. She restructured how decisions moved through the company, insisting on direct input from engineers and staff who had previously been treated as replaceable resources rather than valued voices. She sat in on technical reviews she once would have skipped entirely, asking questions instead of issuing demands, and she made a habit of listening all the way through an explanation before forming a judgment about it. The shift was not dramatic or performative, but it was consistent, week after week, in ways that people around her slowly began to notice and trust. Caleb remained exactly where he had chosen to stay, working as an engineer among the same colleagues he had always worked beside, still wearing the same worn jacket he had on the day the entire crisis began. Nobody in the building spoke of him with the casual dismissal they once had, and new hires quickly learned, through quiet stories passed between desks, exactly what he had done during those 5 defining minutes. He never brought it up himself, never used the story to ask for special treatment, and continued handling his work with the same steady focus he always had. In the evenings he still left at the same hour he always had, heading home to the life he had built quietly away from the company, a life that had nothing to do with titles, threats, or boardrooms, and everything to do with the people who mattered most to him. Charlotte thanked him more than once in the months that followed, each time with the same quiet sincerity, acknowledging that he had saved not only her company but also her own understanding of what leadership was supposed to mean. She never asked him again to change roles or take on more authority than he wanted, and in time she came to see that restraint itself as one of the more important lessons of her career, a recognition that not every form of value needed a title attached to it. The story closed on an ordinary evening, the kind that made no headlines and demanded nothing dramatic, as Charlotte stood near the entrance of the building and watched Caleb walk out into the fading light of sunset. She was no longer only his chief executive, and he was no longer only her employee. They had become, in the plainest and most honest sense, two people who had earned a deep and lasting respect for one another, forged not through titles or authority, but through 5 minutes that had changed everything neither of them expected to learn that day. Some people spend a lifetime chasing titles, convinced that power alone proves their worth, while others quietly hold everything together without ever asking for recognition. Caleb never wanted an empire, only the truth and the chance to protect what mattered to him. Charlotte learned, in the hardest way possible, that real strength means admitting fault and rebuilding with honesty rather than hiding behind authority. The people who prove themselves loudest are not always the ones who carry the most weight. Often it is the quiet ones, working steadily in the background, who hold an entire organization together. If this story moved you, carry its lesson forward. Judge people by their character, not their title, and never let fear of failure replace fairness and respect for those who quietly hold the line every single day.